And I just want to welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. And I look forward to sort of engaging in a conversation and also hearing your perspectives on terrorism, something that unfortunately has become kind of a very ever-present feature of our times. So maybe we'll just start with, when you think terrorism, it may be an obvious question, but what do you think when you think about, we hear terrorism? Okay, yeah, some good answers. And of course, there's much more to it. And I would like to tell you a little bit, kind of go back in time and talk about the history of terrorism, just briefly, and about all different types of terrorism, because yeah, we hear about suicide bombers and ISIS, and we immediately think Islamic extremism, and we will towards the end we'll talk about ISIS and Al Qaeda as well. But I'd like to start with kind of a general overview to broaden the definition and what we think about when we hear terrorism. So I want to show you a few images, and just curious if you recognize some of them. Anyone?
Looks like Moscow.
Actually, it's Belfast, 1972. That's Bloody Friday, and of course Irish Republican Army. And next one. Very good. 1995, April. These will be pretty easy, so we'll just move through them. Kind of moving into the last January, and that's the Charlie Hebdo, the attacks on the magazine. This one may be a little less known. Does anyone recognize this? That's Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines, also an attack in January, yes.
Where?
Z, starting with Zamboanga, yes. This one?
Oh, that's in Australia?
That's actually Denmark. Yeah, but it could, they all look the same pretty much, destruction and... Yeah, that's the one in Denmark. So we've had quite of course, ISIS and related groups have been on the news almost daily especially since January. So what is terrorism and what causes it? Let's kind of try to define it. So basically, at the root of terrorism, there's hatred of other groups, and that's kind of very clear, that serves all kinds of political purposes, which may include an attempt to consolidate power, make claims on the state or other groups, deflect blame for all kinds of things, and also justifying leaders' self-interest. Terrorist organizations often coalesce around a leader, some kind of a strong personality. So we could say, kind of very simply, that at the root of terrorism is just really will to have power and control. So power is kind of at the root of it, saying it in a very simple way. And terrorism, in fact, is related to war and state-making. So its strategy is fundamental to these enterprises. But then we somehow tend to differentiate between patriots who are just trying to oppose an unfair, unjust government, and evil, irrational terrorists. So there's this distinction that is somehow clear. Of course, as some say, one person's liberator may be another person's terrorist. So it's a pretty much a relative term as well. And I'm speaking from just an experience having friends from the Middle East, who just see it in a little different way, maybe. But we'll get into that a little later. So. Both nation states and in fact, individuals, groups can commit acts of terrorism. And these definitions have changed somewhat, but basically, I'm teaching a political sociology course this semester, and we have a chapter on terrorism. So the definition from that book, I think it's a fairly good one, has three parts. So it's the actual violence or threatened violence. political aims of those committing violence, and threat or actual harm to innocent civilians. And there we can, I don't want to kind of bore you with too much theory, but basically the three different, three types of terrorism, can be state terrorism, and especially that occurs especially in weak states where there is a high level of economic inequality, so the differences between the rich and poor, and there's little need or prospect of economic growth, and also typically no open media, so media controlled by the repressive regime. The other type is state-sponsored terrorism, and that refers to the aiding of terrorist groups by nation states. And our own government has been involved in such enterprises. One example is the Contras in Nicaragua. And then sub-state terrorism basically refers to individuals, groups, and organizations that plot and carry out violence against the state to challenge state power. So we are kind of back to power. It's all about power. Since I'm a sociologist, I kind of look, and I'm interested in sociological, and other social science explanations, or the areas where sociologists and other social scientists study terrorism. So kind of some typical questions that social scientists would ask would be, what are the conditions that kind of make it possible, for terrorists to organize and to carry out their activities? What are the decisions? Where do they come from? The mind of the terrorist. Why do people engage in terrorism? So trying to kind of understand their perspective, looking from the perspective of the terrorist. And what are the conditions that facilitate these, these groups? Why do these groups arise? And also, another area, an interesting area, and I'll kind of touch on each of these. I just want to signal them later on. How do terrorists develop their message? How do they recruit people and kind of bring people to their cause? And that's not as straightforward. There are some misconceptions there as well that we will address. So just a few words about the history of terrorism. Depending on we kind of started out with a pretty broad definition. The roots, or the first instance kind of agreed upon somewhat of terrorism kind of dates back to the 1st century AD, and those were activities by a group of Jewish zealots which assassinated collaborators with the Roman rule in the Judea province. But there's some dispute if this was really in the modern sense what terrorism entails. The first use in English of the term was with reference to the French Revolution's reign of terror in the 18th century. When the Jacobins, who ruled the revolutionary state, employed violence, including mass executions. That sounds very familiar, when we talk about ISIS and so on, to compel obedience to the state and also intimidate enemies. And this is when really the modern terrorism dates back to. In fact, the term was thought of as relating to state violence and intimidation until at least mid-19th century, the term terrorism, when it started being associated more with non-state groups, so individuals. As far as ideologies, it's just a wide range of ideologies, but early, in the 19th century, anarchism was the most prominent ideology associated with terrorism, and in fact, anarchists, for example, assassinated the Russian Tsar Alexander II, and towards the end of the 19th century, and also our 25th president, William McKinley, and that was in 1901. And actually, I want to show you. sort of the type. You know, when we look overall at all kinds of terrorist groups, actually the biggest, you know, you can see at the pie chart, it's kind of nice and clear. National separatist groups, religious groups are in the second place, and then all kinds of other groups. So you can take a look at that. And that's the data is from the 60s, late 60s to September 2007.
Worldwide?
Excuse me?
Worldwide?
Yes, overall, yes.
Ma'am,
Yes.
excuse me, do they consider things like when someone shoots an abortion doctor to be an
Yes,
act of terrorism?
yes, that's a very good example. There's, you know, there's the anti-abortion terrorism when, you know, the bombings of clinics and so on. Yes,
Okay.
that's also under the umbrella of the term, and eco-terrorism as well. You know, over environmental issues. So yeah, very good question. Thank you.
Your definition listed prominently the deaths of civilians. Is it terrorism if violence is targeted exclusively at representatives of state authorities, say police officers?
Well, no, you know, it's just kind of indiscriminate. I'm sorry if could you restate the question?
Your definition on the PowerPoint
Mhm.
had it involved the death of innocent civilians, which
Right.
is non-combatants, people destroyed, etc. Would violence targeting representatives of state authority, soldiers, tax collectors, police officers, and so on?
It could be considered terrorism, and in fact, you know, I was going to mention you know, we've seen recent reports of, you know, about sovereign citizens, right, organization that targeting especially. I thought maybe you were referring to that somewhat. That would be considered terrorism.
I'll say Americans, tar and feathering tax collectors in British North America. That would,
Yeah, you know, I would say that, and this maybe will become clear as we go on, that, you know, if there's an ideology that targets specific populations, then that would be terrorism. You know, it's kind of a broad term. So yeah, that's a good question, though. Thank you. So just kind of continuing on into the 20th century, moving on. In the 20th century, terrorism continued to be associated with a vast array of anarchist, socialist, fascist, and nationalist groups, and many of them, you know, and that's what's also, you know, into the 60s and later nationalist and separatist movements as well. That's what's also showing this chart. One example of nationalist struggles that engage in terrorist activities would be the Irish nationalists at various points in time, also Jews and Palestinians. Of course, there's a long history of terrorism against each other on both sides. And then some other examples, again showing how broad this term is: partisan resistant movement against the occupiers during World War II, or, you know, Basque separatist movements as well. Just kind of a side note, what's kind of interesting about the different terrorist groups, they often kind of inspire each other, you know, even across different countries and continents. So, for example, leftist Baader-Meinhof group in the 1960s and 1970s in Germany was inspired and cooperated with the Maoist Che Guevara and also the Viet Cong. So, so they're kind of interesting links. And the Irish Republican Army provided arms to FARC in Colombia and the PLO, or the Palestinian Liberation Organization. So, you know, they may supply arms, and might not only be kind of ideological, but practical as well. In the Americas in the 20th century, especially between 1960s and 1980s, several groups sprung up, including a Quebec Liberation Organization. Again, just kind of random examples just to give you an idea. Jewish Defense League in New York, both right and left-wing groups in Colombia, and others. And one that we already mentioned, you know, another type is the anti-abortion terrorism and also eco-terrorism that we mentioned already. I just want to show you another chart here. So terrorist incidents by global region. So you can see that the Middle East has been it's the proportion is quite striking. Most of them in the past. Excuse me. Yes.
To make it to be called terrorist, do you have to first committed some kind of a violent act that goes beyond like misdemeanor stuff, or what moves you from just a protester to a terrorist?
Yes, it's violence, but it doesn't have to be actually the actual. It could be intimidation and just controlling by threatening and intimidating. But it usually involves violence as well. Physical violence and killing and so on. So it's a good question as well. So.
Occupy Wall Street go anywhere near that definition, or
No. No, they're just protesters basically, and I would say a social movement. There are all kinds of other groups that not all groups that have an ideology are terrorist groups. So it's I think the violence is the marker of terrorism. Yes. So I think that's a good way to kind of to think about that. But yeah, good question.
So what about gangs?
Well, gangs usually do not have kind of an ideology. They are on a smaller scale. They are usually have to do with cities, and it's not the same. No. So even though they do use violence and kind of fight each other and so on, but they usually do not target. I don't study gangs, but as far as I know, they don't just pretty much target each other and not really others.
What about in Honduras?
I'm sorry?
In Honduras, there's a reign of terror with gangs. That's why we have the immigration crisis.
It's still a different, it's has to do with an ideology that there may be kind of terrorist tactics used and killings and so on, but it's not quite the same.
and what about the Ku Klux Klan?
That's a terrorist organization. Yes, many consider that's a great example. Yeah, and actually I had it in my notes, but yeah, so that's a good example.
Individualism and ideology?
Individualism is.
We're stronger, so we should eat better.
Yeah.
That could be an ideology of sorts.
Right, but not every ideology leads to terrorism.
I just mentioned in relation to gangs.
But well, gangs are not considered to be terrorist organizations, I guess. But what I was going to say is pretty much all terrorists have an ideology, but ideology by itself it's not, just a little bit different. So by kind of moving on to the end of the 20th century, and this will be the focus of the rest of this presentation. We'll be on a timeline that starts in the 1980s, and we'll kind of more and more focus now on specifically on Islamic extremist violence, and we look at the 1980s because many of these groups were inspired initially by Iran's Islamic Revolution, in a very general way, inspired by the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979. So a lot of these groups kind of came after that event. So some of the major events in the 21st century, of course, September 11th, and then Moscow theater siege in 2001 as well. 2003, Istanbul bombings, and also bombings in Madrid, an attack on trains. In 2005, London bombings, and then in 2008, Mumbai hotel siege, and 2011, Norway attacks. So these are just a few that have been that were highly publicized, and many of you may remember these. So as you are probably, some of the questions that came up helped to kind of us to see that just the run through all these groups hopefully helped us see that there are all kinds of political goals that come into play when we talk about terrorism. However, even though ideology is what's the kind of is how terrorist groups market their message, so to speak. surprisingly, and this is one misconception that I'd like to talk about. The ideology is not necessarily the most important element. Psychology and sociology actually offer some interesting insights into factors that predict or make it more likely that someone might be a terrorist material, so to speak. For example, they include personality traits such as low self-esteem, lack of interpersonal trust, and so on. Other findings also suggest traits such as self-destructive, willing to self-sacrifice. These are not surprising when we talk about bombers, suicide bombers, and so on. So these are pretty self-explanatory. But also a lack of well-defined ideological persuasion. And so, these are often individuals who actually are looking to identify with something, maybe looking for a community in a way, and they don't have a strong ideology to begin with. It's sort of like, I don't know if any of you have had, or among your friends or you yourself had any experience with cults. Has anyone met anyone who's been a cult member or? So it's kind of like that, there's this message, people who are looking for some kind of identity, belonging, who maybe, for example, are not people who didn't grow up being religious. And then, they get into these very religious cults, and because maybe there was something missing in their life or what have you. But what is your experience with specific, was that a religious cult or? Because that's not the only kind, but there are also political cults of all sorts. And I think terrorism is somewhat similar on some level, and at least in recruiting people, who might be in need of some sort of identity. The typical profile is also male, young, middle class, and economically marginalized. In the case of ISIS, the females, we know that women have also been recruited, and some, of course, have been enslaved and coerced into joining to be wives of the fighters and so on. But women have been willing participants, and in fact, there are 3 girls in England missing, right, who likely have found their way through Turkey to Syria. There are some other structural elements, that make people join terrorist organizations. But kind of one interesting, more kind of like bigger concept is globalization, actually, and globalization is seen as creating a condition for modern forms of terrorism to come into play, because it's due to the kind of this very quick spread of Western values that kind of penetrate the globe and cause, in some cases, cause conflict and clash with other ideologies and values, especially in the case that we'll be discussing, Western values and fundamental Islamic views that are, of course, at odds, very much so. Just, since we're talking about, how people get recruited, and I'll say a little bit more about that later as well, but the interesting element of these ideologies is that I just want to mention briefly is that for example, in the case of Al-Qaeda, there was the storytelling had a very important role in just kind of packaging the message and mobilizing people. So these Al-Qaeda would kind of create these narratives, really, that were used to reinforce views on kind of global grievances against the secular Western states and so on, and would help in recruiting new members and kind of justify their actions, and also develop new ideas on tactics and new targets. So these. I just found this article. It was kind of interesting because some of these stories were printed in that. So these narratives would have like some kind of a beginning point, middle part, and an end. So, for example, the beginning point would be that Muslims are under attack And then, this was kind of the setup. And then the second part of it was only we, Al-Qaeda, and its followers are fighting the oppressors of Islam. So we can save, we're kind of the saviors of Islam, and we have a very important role. And so if you are not supporting Al-Qaeda, then you are supporting the oppressors. So this is very typical in these terrorist groups that the other groups, the non-Al-Qaeda groups or what have you, are kind of the other that's excluded, and there's no middle ground. It's, us or them, basically. So this is kind of interesting, and the storytelling has been used to create this mythology around these organizations. I think I have next. Okay, so what has been done to respond to terrorism? And of course, this is fairly known. Military action, covert action, diplomacy, economic sanctions, humanitarian aid, and also peacemaking have all been used to fight terrorism. And of course, how the response. The way the response is fashioned depends on the type of terrorism. But in the case of Islamic terrorist organizations, specifically, the U.S. has used counterterrorism, so all kinds of intelligence gathering, cutting off financial support, and so on. Counterinsurgency, which is basically support for groups that are on the ground within the country to aid in fighting terrorists, and combined with conventional warfare, of course. Another way that has been used to fight terrorism, it's, in case of especially state-sponsored terrorism or state terrorism, has been repression. So an effort to expand surveillance and use torture, actually, even by democratic states. It's controversial, but democratic states have used torture to actually repress, to fight terrorism. Another way is trying to relieve some structural causes, so the differences, inequalities, all kinds of societal inequalities, and kind of diminishing them to appease maybe the population and minimize terrorist attacks, and so on. So before we move on into our case of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, what do you think about prospects for? Do you think that terrorism will ever be eradicated, or does anyone have any? Okay. So does anyone think that there is a chance? Bill?
Yeah. At some point there won't be humans anymore. Pretty confident.
Okay.
We've still spiral out of control whether we're here or not.
So yeah, it's pretty scary, huh? But anyway, there are, like in social sciences, there are two views, of course. The optimists think that eventually technological innovations and globalizations kind of make some social and physical differences less relevant, and therefore will eventually lead to a decreased likelihood of terrorist activities. On the other hand, the pessimists say that that inequality is in fact increasing, so there will be more conflict, and also environmental changes, depletion of natural resources will be a major issue that will keep fueling terrorism, and in fact, this is kind of a relevant point when we talk about ISIS, which we'll see in just a minute. Okay, so this brings us to actually to our case, and I think the reason I just really wanted to talk about them, at first I was thinking I just want to talk about ISIS, and because this seems to be does Al-Qaeda even matter anymore? But I just thought that it's very, very important to talk about Al-Qaeda because it kind of in comparison, because it will show us how perhaps the danger that ISIS poses compared to Al-Qaeda. So yeah, Al-Qaeda is actually still a threat, not as it's greatly diminished, but it does pose. It's still active, and especially in North Africa and Yemen. But of course, ISIS has kind of taken over, the spotlight. And in fact, this happened by surprise. What's the earliest that you heard about ISIS, by the way? About a year ago, so about February, yeah.
By its name or
Just it came to your, what is this? You saw ISIS, and
uh,
about a year in February, yeah. I think that's, yes.
an article about Zaqqari, Abu Zaqqari killing Shia.
Territorial advances. So basically, what happened is the group seized a major city in Iraq, Mosul, last June, and that's about the time when I started paying closer attention, I have to say, and in fact, its leader, by the name Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, has been ISIS leader since May 2010, but until last summer, really the only time that he was seen was was a grainy picture, a very unclear picture, a mugshot really from his stay at a U.S. prison at Camp Bucca in Iraq during the occupation of the country. And then, a few years later, 4 years later, last July, there was a much clearer picture when he made a speech, or I should say sermon, gave a sermon, a Ramadan sermon on July 5th. And he basically introduced himself as a caliph, so a leader of Muslims. So from a hunted guerrilla, a prisoner and a hunted guerrilla commander, he became kind of the commander of all Muslims all of a sudden. So let's kind of take a look at let's compare Al-Qaeda and a little bit more closely. So Al-Qaeda came into existence sometime between 1988 and 89, and then ISIS originated really, it's true that it's been in existence for a while. Originated in 1999, and at that time initially it had a different name, but then rebranded itself as Al-Qaeda in Iraq to show allegiance to Al-Qaeda, and that happened in 2004. In addition to Iraq and Syria, it just currently ISIS operates also in eastern Libya, Sinai Peninsula of Egypt, and other areas of the Middle East. However, it's and also South Asia and Southeast Asia, but it holds territory in Syria and Iraq, which we'll see a little bit more detail in just a second. So the ideology of both groups is somewhat similar, just has some resemblance, and the long-range goals generally are similar. But some people think that ISIS is just an outgrowth. But in fact, experts argue that it's a successor. It's a very different type of an organization than Al-Qaeda. Some even went as far, and this is kind of shows we had a debate about our gangster, terrorist organization and so on. Some experts actually say that Al-Qaeda is not a terrorist, or ISIS is not a terrorist organization at all. So there is a little bit of a debate about it. So why are these two different, Al-Qaeda and ISIS? So Al-Qaeda has only dozens of hundreds of members, attacks civilians, but really doesn't hold any land, doesn't hold any territory, and cannot really confront military forces, and relies on kind of a surprise attacks and so on. And that, not only because, also, of course, Al-Qaeda has organized those big spectacular attacks that we became a victim to as well. On the other hand, ISIS has 30,000 fighters, regular fighters, holds territory in both Iraq and Syria, has extensive military capabilities, controls lines of communication, commands infrastructure, funds itself, and engages in sophisticated military operations. So some have called it actually a pseudo-state, a state-like organization as opposed to just a terrorist organization, since it does have a conventional army, for example. So again, different histories. Al-Qaeda came into into existence after basically following the Soviet invasion in 1979 of Afghanistan, and its views were largely shaped by that and by its fight against the Soviets. It then became a global network focused on carrying spectacular attacks. Its goal was really mobilizing Muslims to join a global confrontation with secular powers, especially the West. On the other hand, ISIS came into being as a result of the 2003 US invasion of Iraq. So it's directly tied to that. And initially it was just one of a number of Sunni extremist groups that were fighting the US forces and also attacking Shiite civilians. So then, you know, in fact, its leader, at the time it was called, initially it was called, as Adrian mentioned, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, to show its allegiance to Al-Qaeda. And its leader, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, died in a US airstrike in 2007. And after, you know, losing the leader, it was greatly diminished and didn't really pose a threat. However, Aki, or, you know, the Al-Qaeda in Iraq renewed itself within the prisons, you know, within the U.S. prisons in Iraq, where current chief al-Baghdadi, who we already mentioned, distinguished himself as a leader and showed himself as a leader. And the group was kind of in a very sophisticated way, took advantage of a revolt against the Assad regime in Syria in 2011. And you know, it became a full-blown civil war at the time. And due to the chaos, ISIS was able to actually seize territory in some important cities at that time. And also change and sort of establish their base of operation. Their base of operation is really in Syria. And that's when, in 2011, they also adopted the name of ISIS. And you know, sometimes it's called ISIL and ISIS and Islamic State. I have to explain that I'm sort of against using the Islamic State name because this kind of legitimizes, at least, you know, seems to legitimize it as a state. So I use ISIS. I do that on purpose. But you will see the 3 different names being circulated. So in Syria, it established a base at that time. In Iraq, it started sort of trying to exploit the fragmentation, you know, the sectarian conflict in Iraq, and which got much worse after U.S. withdrew in 2011. And basically, Prime Minister Maliki's government was kind of left to its own devices and made some policy mistakes and so on, which were kind of used by ISIS and to its advantage. So as a result of policies of al-Maliki, for example, the government, Iraqi government, alienated Sunnis and who joined ISIS, and in fact now former Iraqi military officers count, or ISIS can count them among its members. I just want to show you a few more the maps and kind of to show you the extent of ISIS control in Iraq and Syria, and it's actually larger currently. Overall it's larger than the UK, the territory of the UK. So it's a sizable territory, and some strategic oil-rich areas and cities, Fallujah, Ramadi, Mosul, Tikrit, and others in Iraq. Pseudo-state is this is what the experts call it. It's not a legitimized. So it's not a state, a country, a state that's a part of the international community. That's one of the I think there are 190-something states. So it's kind of it acts like a state, but it's not really a state. But it has, and I'll actually will be talking about it very soon about why it's considered a state. Exactly. Yeah, I think you could say. And legitimate. It's not illegitimate, but it basically it fulfills the functions of the state in many ways.
What
So.
is legitimate authority?
It has to do not necessarily with elected, but where the people are cohesive to some extent and who the leaders are. That they're legitimate either by election or by chosen or by God or whatever it might be, you know, kings or whatever. But where it's agreed upon as opposed to somebody grabbing power in a state, in a country like in Iraq and trying to take over, which is what I
And intimidating and enslaving basically populations. So yeah, thank you. No, that's perfect. So we mentioned the foreign fighters. You know, this is really kind of an interesting issue. So U.S. estimates that there are currently ISIS has about 15,000 foreign fighters from 80 countries, and this increases by about 1,000 per month. So, so very rapidly, some of the countries, you can see Tunisia is by far the largest supplier, so to speak, and then Saudi Arabia, but also Australia, China, Russia, Western Europe, and the US. And yes?
Well, I was just going to say, I heard on the news today, 200 maybe from the U.S.
Right, and it's actually, and I even have cities, Denver, especially Denver, Minneapolis, and Chicago suburbs. So often middle class young people, and you know I lived in Minneapolis for a while, so I can see it. I know there's a large Somali population. I know some of those young men have gone, and so it's quite remarkable, quite interesting, and we'll talk about why this happens in just a minute, because I think that's kind of an interesting area as well.
Are you going to talk about who supports? How do they get the funding to?
Yes, I will. Yep, shortly. So, because that's the key, really. Yeah, it's a very important point. Thanks for bringing that up. So. So again, while Al-Qaeda is kind of wanted to see itself as the vanguard of global insurgency, mobilizing Muslims against secular rule, ISIS actually seeks to be a state. So, you know, and it has, and eventually the goal is to just have military authority over all of world's Muslims. So it's a very ambitious plan. And you know, I'm going to skip that part, but it's very interesting. There has been some debate about is ISIS really Islamic? Is killing, indiscriminate killing, and including Muslims, Islamic? So there's an interesting debate about it, and I guess the conclusion is they are very Islamic. It's a brand of Islam that they represent. But there has been a debate. I just want to signal that if you are more interested in that, I can provide some guidance as to what would be good sources. Okay, so how does ISIS operate? We'll get at the question of money and so on. So. And this comes into play especially in trying to fight ISIS. So what worked with Al-Qaeda that does not work with ISIS, and that's infrastructure of intelligence, law enforcement, and military operations, is the one of the important points here is that they cluster in urban areas. So they kind of hide among civilian populations and are very well integrated into civilian operations. So attacks and raids would basically kill a lot of innocent civilians and definitely would not work. The other element that makes it very difficult to really fight them is this pseudo-state that we've been kind of talking about. And in fact, it has a very complex administrative structure. So the military is very important, of course, and then the leader, which is al-Baghdadi, and he has 2 deputies. And then there's a bureaucracy that's supervised by 12 administrators that handle finances and media and religious affairs. In fact, the structure makes it possible for ISIS to survive even if al-Baghdadi is killed. So it's not really based primarily on the leader, unlike Al-Qaeda to some extent. So while it was fairly easy to cut off Al-Qaeda's funding, ISIS does not need outside money. To answer your question, it does not need any funding. It holds key oil assets in eastern Syria. And in fact, it controls 60% of oil production currently and, in Syria, and relies on selling it on the black market in Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Turkey. So in Mosul, for example, there are other ways to get money, of course. It has looted the central bank in Mosul and other small banks. So it steals anything of value. But the oil is the basis, and also I know if anybody has seen the article on organ harvesting for sale, so and drugs and so on. So, but yeah, oil is the foundation. Okay, so let's get to the kind of how does it attract followers in face of this brutality that is shown without any shame. So, in the case of Al-Qaeda, it was, again, comparing with Al-Qaeda, it was quite easy to delegitimize it by publicizing its violence, because Al-Qaeda didn't really show off, the violence. It didn't boast, that it was committing violence, especially on Muslims, on fellow Muslims. And that eventually was one of the elements that led to an outrage, by other Muslims, just overall at large. In fact, in the Al-Qaeda's case, it started losing support around 2007, among other things, as a result of just this coming to light. And in fact, in 2013, just an interesting fact, Pew Research Center did a study among Muslims and found that overall among Muslims, Al-Qaeda enjoyed disapproval or had disapproval of 57. So didn't enjoy much of an approval. And in some countries, it was overwhelming. In Lebanon, it was 96%, at 96%. So quite, almost the entire population. ISIS, on the other hand, seems immune to the risk of backlash. Baghdadi made a claim to religious authority, but the organization doesn't really care about legitimacy, but really seems to care about raw power and revenge. In fact, as I already mentioned, it boasts its brutality, beheadings, burnings of caged people, and parading them, and so on. To intimidate, and it's basically done on purpose, shamelessly, to intimidate and suppress dissent and demonstrate its power and ruthlessness. It also kind of seems to give it an aura of strength, at least for the moment, and we'll have to see if this will. It seems to be breaking apart a little bit following the Jordanian pilot's death. Because that outraged, Muslims everywhere, and just the brutality of it. But anyway, this is what ISIS doesn't have a problem with being known, as ruthless and brutal. So it has been really hard to fight against the recruitment efforts because ISIS has been very successful in recruiting young people, and this, I'll tell you why that is. So the difference is in really the message to young people. Al-Qaeda, I think this image is very representative. So this was Al-Qaeda's image, right? Some older men sitting in cages, in caves, I was going to say. And the message was, they tried to portray the message of religious legitimacy and piety, no sex or alcohol, and propaganda just kind of showed these, ascetic sort of warriors sitting in caves, studying libraries, and so on. ISIS, on the other hand, is just, kind of you have just these, fighters walking shamelessly through town, marching, in this case, in Raqqa, Syria. So there's this contrasting message of adventure, personal power, sense of self and community. Exhilarating podcasts, are put together from the front line. And another element very different from Al-Qaeda is kind of open access to sexual partners. And in fact, some women have been willing participants, but others have been enslaved and coerced into these roles. So ISIS offers this kind of short-term primitive gratification that seems to be attractive to a lot of young people, and teenagers, in fact, may get attracted without really understanding the message, just by this powerful, exhilarating type of a reality that and life that joining ISIS offers. So I hope you are starting to see that it's a pretty difficult enemy to fight, just at least for the moment. And unfortunately, our administration has been very slow in adapting to its policies to the new reality and the true nature of the threat, which has not been really well understood. So in Syria, the U.S. counterterrorism just kind of continued and prioritized bombings and so on, and try to work with the local populations and also help in the effort, but according to many experts, these are not effective ways, for some of the reasons that I already explained today, and in Iraq, it's in a way, the administration is kind of looking back at the military surge in Iraq in 2007, which was hugely successful, and in fact reduced attacks by Al-Qaeda by 80% by 2008, within a year. But this would not work with ISIS, unfortunately, because of different political realities. And we really kind of lost by withdrawing in 2011. And I'm not criticizing that decision because overwhelmingly the U.S. public opinion was in support of withdrawal of troops. Well, maybe not overwhelmingly, but it's really I think we were all ready for that. But in fact, we lost a lot of control over the situation, and and the government in Iraq hasn't really been a good force for uniting the country by supporting its own kind of ethnic group or religious group, I should say, the Shiites. So, and counterinsurgency worked with Al-Qaeda in dividing the fighters from many different countries. But in this case, ISIS is now really led by well-trained officers who are trained by the U.S. So they know all, they know our thinking, and so they are kind of a difficult opponent for that reason, because they just know the U.S. techniques and habits. They are also armed with our weapons, with U.S. tanks, artillery, armored Humvees, and mine-resistant vehicles. And so the Saddam era officers are really back in charge with ISIS, and they're really enjoying it. And the idea of a conventional war has been tossed around, but it doesn't seem like the U.S. public would support it. So there are really no good military options. So what can be done? So one, there was just an article in Foreign Affairs that, and I had the name of the author, but if you're interested, I can point you in the right direction. But it was just this March issue that that advocated of kind of an offensive containment. So combining a limited military campaign with a major diplomatic and economic effort to weaken ISIS, and align with many countries that are also threatened by it. So from Russia, Jordan, Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Iran is, by the way, a local power in the Middle East. So that's also, of course, even though somewhat shares into ideology, but it's also threatened by the rise of ISIS and by its success. This expert thought that U.S. should continue to advise and support the military in Iraq, and also assist regional forces such as the Kurdish Peshmerga, who have been taking a hit too. We've seen that also in the news in recent days, even who have had losses but have been fighting fighting ISIS as well. Just a few more. We are almost done here, and I'll be happy to engage, and kind of get your perspectives. But there was there was a recent summit, I think, just earlier this month on counterterrorism in Washington D.C. and the issue of how to fight, of course, especially radical jihadism was discussed as well. Although it was kind of interesting. I don't know if something that we mentioned at the very beginning of this meeting that this idea of sovereign citizens as a big threat came all of a sudden came out, and also our president tried to stay away from associating terrorism with Islam specifically, and has been criticized for it. I just do, to some extent, understand Obama's argument, actually, because the vast majority of Muslims do not support ISIS. So it's kind of an effort to acknowledge that and not kind of offend them, I guess, and kind of involve them, include them in this effort as well. At least their minds, to support the effort against ISIS. But unfortunately, this summit was focused very much on the traditional efforts and didn't take into account the new nature of ISIS. And because ISIS is really, again, just to reiterate that point, that it's a very different type of an animal. It basically challenges the international order. And unlike the diminished Al-Qaeda, it's coming closer to becoming a state. It may eventually, we may be forced to accept it as a state because maybe that may become at some point what happens. There is some sign, though, that the world may be united against ISIS. Even, of course, Jordan joined. And Jordan has been involved in the fight less visibly prior to the last bombings and so on in retaliation for the killing of its pilot. Also, France just deployed an aircraft carrier to fight ISIS. So hopefully the international community is coming together and just to really combat this serious threat. So it remains to be seen how the situation develops. And of course, over time, there may be better policy options than containment that I just discussed, and the limited military campaign and diplomatic efforts that are taking place. So thank you. And if you have any... Do you have any comments, questions?
Next move, what is their long-term goal?
There was something about meeting the armies of Rome or something. So, well, we don't know, but definitely trying to consolidate power in these areas and advancing to take on. In Syria, yes, and it's present, in other countries that are even, in Asian countries, and so. So it remains to be seen, but definitely, there's a threat of it's expanding.
Terrorist branch like Al-Qaeda.
Excuse me?
ISIS is over there, Al-Qaeda is there. Does ISIS have a terrorist branch?
Well, there are just people who align themselves, and the lone wolves. You probably have heard that. They just, the terrorist attack in Denmark was actually carried out by an ISIS sympathizer. So it's like they don't need to have, in a way, a cell, or they don't need to have an organized. In fact, it's easier to just have people who will work on its behalf. So, but that's a good question. Yeah, it's just much more difficult to pinpoint. Kathy.
About they're funded, apparently we know, through black market sales of oil. So don't we have some control, or can we impact that in some way?
No, well, not very well, because it's there are always those willing to buy that to buy that oil.
International shipping, can we?
Well, it's within the region, though. So yeah, definitely, to some extent. But it's just very difficult to do that. It has proven to be difficult, as far as I know, to do that. So, but yeah, hopefully, there's some way to counteract that, because that brings a lot of money. Yes.
the Sunni versus the Shia issue, because it's floating around that a lot of this stuff is, well, Iran's on one side, maybe Saudi Arabia's on the other, or whatever, but there's a lot of discussion about that, and so what do you say?
I'm sorry. Oh yeah, it's very, it's a very complicated. Even without Iraq, right? These groups have
Well,
been
whoever, Shia versus Sunni.
right. Exactly.
Demarcation.
Exactly, and so it's kind of like it's complicated, but just for that reason, but then it really depends much. I talked about the prime minister in Iraq who is a Shiite and kind of support instead of trying to include the Sunnis in his government and kind of marginalize them and made them turn against the efforts to unify the country and basically work with ISIS. So it's I don't know if that answers the question.
Called the surge a huge success. Well, it wasn't by its own justification. It was a complete failure. The plan was to, by clamping down on the violence, to create a political environment that would allow compromises between the Sunni and the Shiite groups. The clamping down on the violence was the means to that end. The compromises did not happen because the Shiite government refused to make any compromises. And so the means of clamping down the violence then became the justification for the surge. And essentially saying the surge was a success because it clamped down the violence is revisionism. The original plan was always to clamp down the violence to get the compromises necessary, and the compromises were vital because Iraq just fell apart because then ISIS rose up because the compromises were made. So
Yeah, I would say realities of politics. Things, the way moves are justified has to do with policy, but I would still say that from the point of view of populations in Iraq, it was a success. If the attacks were reduced by 60%, and so the violence was, in this sense, I don't think I used the word huge. In that, so yeah, I didn't mean to. Those definitely, measured by that, reduction in attacks.
that's just a blip. That's just temporary because the underlying causes
Well,
weren't dealt with.
it was depending on what would happen later, and and now looking back, it was successful in reducing attacks at the time, and and that opportunity was wasted, but that's.
So it failed.
It depends. It depends.
No, we didn't fail because the Iraqi government refused to make the compromise. We weren't telling them what to do.
Well, what I was trying to talk about, there it was, just thinking about our military options, that just to kind of highlight that discussion. So and your points are well taken. So it's thank you for stating your opinion on that. And I'm sorry.
She's had her hand that up.
Okay. Yes, and I'm sorry. I didn't mean to.
No, I have to admit I'm very ignorant really about the countries in the Middle East and everything, but I find it difficult that how some of the countries like Saudi Arabia, which is kind of more or less a stable country, why aren't they more involved in this effort against ISIS? Because as ISIS gains power, it's going to eventually threaten them. They have to have their head in the sand,
Well,
to ignore it. And yet it seems like everybody's looking to the United States, which is, clear across the other side of the world, or European countries to help combat this. I would feel a lot better if I felt that areas closer to that conflict were more engaged in it than they seem to be. Like Turkey, I'm not, you've got the Kurdish fighters there, but like I say, you've got Saudi Arabia and some of those other countries that have fairly...
and they have actually worked with the U.S., to
Yeah,
fight
but you
ISIS.
never hear about
Well, you
it.
don't hear about it because they're in the regions, and it's not a popular. That's a great point, though. I think, I think many of us think that, well, why, it's their region, do they want to have this slaughter, and those
Are they
problems?
happy with the
Yeah,
situation?
yeah,
I don't
right.
understand.
But I think we make the mistake of, they don't think like us. It's a different region, different history, different relationships, different, Iran is the kind of regional power, important power, and Iran, in fact, is also, not openly, but it's also, fighting ISIS. Is not in favor of ISIS, definitely. Saudi Arabia, Jordan has been a part of the coalition, but not as visibly as following the death of the pilot. And that was also very cultural, and just knowing and having been to the Middle East, and it's just kind of a very cultural thing, it's like, let's take revenge, it was kind of, there was that quality, it wasn't level-headed, it was like, let's just bomb them, to take revenge. But Jordan had been involved, even prior to that, but, we didn't really hear about it because, some of it is, associating with the U.S. is not always a popular thing in the region. So just because of the attitudes towards the
reality of
U.S.
it is we know that ISIS, as they gain this power, they're not going to be happy with just, Syria and Iraq or,
Oh, yeah.
whatever, that they want to take it all over.
Well, and most of the people, as I was giving the numbers, in some countries in Lebanon, and that's a country that I visited, it's a kind of very strong Western influence, and a lot of educated people and so on. 96% oppose ISIS, and it's in many of the countries, the population, nobody wants that, that kind of brutal, extreme Islam. It's most people, it's a small, but unfortunately very powerful because very organized, and backed by military, by its own military power, force. So it's really, yeah. So I mean, you are making great points, but it's just it's a different reality, unfortunately. Yes, you had a.
I
Yeah.
kind of want to bring it to here.
Sure.
You talked about income inequality being one of the factors involved, and then not having a clear ideology to follow. We have a lot of political posturing going on about income inequality, and we also, I think we used to get our ideology from our religion, church, whatever, or even if you didn't go to church, you had that Judeo-Christian
Common
ideology.
values, yes,
Right,
the common values.
And I find that that's less and less true, that young people are not involved in that to the extent that my generation was. And are they floating around, or what are they doing as far as having a structured ideology that they kind of, I believe this and would give my life for this?
That's what I actually wondered. The other day I was thinking about that, and of course I don't have the numbers, and how many of these young people who actually go and fight with ISIS, if they are religious or what their background is. It will be interesting to look at that. So perhaps there's some vacuum of they need some spiritual some goal in life, something bigger than themselves, and that they didn't get at home because increasingly people don't go to church, they don't have strong communities, and so on. And I wonder if that plays a role, but I don't know. I would have to look at it closely. But this is a good point. Be my guess that it plays a role. But and we have a sociologist who maybe would.
Yeah, I would think a little bit about the social psychology of the whole thing. And if you look at internationally, which countries these fighters are attracted from, and you look at some of the strategies that ISIS uses for recruitment, and they're on YouTube, and these guys have Facebook accounts, and they're attracting young people. And it's not young people who may have immigrated to the United States 2 years ago, and now they see that their former countries in conflict and they're returning. You've got second and third generation children, grandchildren of immigrants. And interestingly enough, it's very similar to what we saw in the 1970s and 1980s with the IRA, where you have a lot of Catholic American descendants of Irish immigrants, children and grandchildren of Irish immigrants, in smaller numbers actually going to fight in Northern Ireland, but in fairly large numbers making monetary and other political contributions to those causes. So if you think of it in those terms, where you're a second, third generation immigrant who is not fully accepted by your home country, whether that's in England and you're from halfway around the world in Pakistan, and you're your grandchild of Pakistani immigrants in England, or you're a second-generation Somali immigrant from the outskirts of Chicago, and never fully accepted there. And then you hear this recruitment, your ancestral and ethnic way of life is under threat. And what can you do to come support them? And they see these images of these cool, good-looking fighters marching in step, and you see they've all got their Nikes and their Adidas shoes on.
And cars, they give them cars, you know, and all kinds of material. It's just a lot of
These are
money
not young
involved.
people that are necessarily going to be welcomed into the local university fraternity, and I think this is a big part of that. And so you have people, and there's the income inequality, but these, as you mentioned, these are middle-class people, both in the country and from other countries, that are being drawn to this conflict. It's not people from that would be traditional, recruited by gangs in the United States or in England. You have people who are not economically challenged in their home country, and they're leaving their home country to go fight in Syria or in Lebanon. And so I think that gives you a little bit of a feeling about what some of the people that might be feeling when they're going. It's not just, you know, evil people from that one particular region, but they're drawn there to that ideology if they want to seek and support or preserve some concept of what they think their ancestors or their ethnic group's life ought to have been like in some idealized world.
And you know, and I think the problem is, and this, you know, and I'm an immigrant 25 years ago, and I, you know, and we in the U.S., you know, we have good efforts to integrate the you know, immigrants to some extent, you know, provide English classes, et cetera, et cetera. But you know, I lived in I don't think it's equally, you know, with all different immigrants. You know, I lived in Minnesota, and I saw, you know, there the Somali refugees or the immigrants kind of live in their own communities, you know, and they have their own stores, and they are really not integrated. You know, maybe it's easier for that kind of gets at you know, at some questions of race, ethnicity, and so on, and how people integrate into our society. But it's I think it's very difficult for them to be accepted, and you know, and then the traditional family values. I think the families are also kind of self-contained, and they don't integrate. They kind of, you know, unless they are educated, and some are, you know, I knew professors who were Somali immigrants and so on, but it's most of these people are not well integrated, you know, and their kids are not, because the parents sometimes don't speak English, they never learn, you know, and the kids translate for them. So I've seen all kinds of things like that, but they live in separate communities, separate buildings, and separate areas, at least in Minneapolis.
Middle class people with the resources and in seeking an ideology and in that age range.
Yeah.
And the other part of the recruiting is, of course, they learned from the best. I mean, if you look at, it's really interesting to see the, you know, Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda in 1988, 1989. But if, you know, the full picture, of course, would be Osama bin Laden forms Al Qaeda and through the support of the United States, right, in order to.
There's much more to it,
combat
yes.
the Soviets.
Right,
So they
right.
learned a lot of those both military tactics
Right.
and propaganda tactics
Oh,
from
yeah.
the United States, which brings us back to the whole conversation about the difference between a terrorist act and a terrorist organization, because obviously we have state-sponsored terrorism, including the United States, and state-sponsored
Right.
terrorism in other countries like in Afghanistan.
And Cuba and Nicaragua and so on. But you had a question, and you've been waiting.
yes.
Are you sure?
Well, she brought up a thought for me that was, in our country, since we're seeing this disparity in income and the change in the income levels, and the lack of people growing up with a firm ideological conviction, are we going to see a rise of terrorism in the United States?
All
You
it
know?
would take is leadership. I mean, if we had an Osama bin Laden.
Well, I went to the website of the Sovereign Citizens, and they claim to have 300,000 people or something like that. So yeah, I don't know, but it's you know, that's an interesting kind of area of research maybe for social scientists. You know what the lack of kind of good foundation in as far as values, and it's something that used to be played by religion, basically, you know, people being religious and so on. If that plays somehow a role, I think that would be something interesting to look at. But yeah.
Well, and another factor is patriotism. You know, in my generation, we were taught patriotism. You know, you saluted the flag, and you sang the Star Spangled Banner, and you stood up straight and tall. And kids don't do that anymore either.
Yeah, you teach them to to undermine, right, and to fight against injustices, and this is a good thing too, right? But there has to be a balance. So yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, no, that's a valid point.
The same thing that facilitates terrorism is the same thing that can facilitate fascism.
Yeah. There you go.
Does anyone ever
I actually, would you mind letting, because she isn't.
Thank you. Reading through this book about Islam, it's taken me years to get through the thing. Something that I think is quite interesting, that a day that marks the high point of Muslim expansion in Europe, September 11th, 1683. That's why they chose September 11th.
Ah, there you go. Interesting. Yeah. No, thanks for bringing that up. That's great. Thank you.
Just wanted to bring that up. It's been going on since God was a little boy.
Well, those symbols are important. When you try to.
There's a line around about Armageddon, throw that in there.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, that's a good point.
That's what ISIS supposedly wants, is the coming of the 12th month.
But-
all these people are pushing for the same thing, which is whatever the big change is going to be in their Messiah, leader, spiritual gift is going to come. All of them, no. Jews have that, Christians have it, and now Islam's have it. They all want the same thing.
So yeah, some have likened sort of the way it operates to David Koresh's or Jim Jones's way of thinking. Definitely there's that element. Except they are creating this powerful state with the bureaucracy and and all that. But that it's not necessarily incompatible. But it's a good point. Thanks for raising it too.
I have a
Yes.
quick historian question.
Sure.
Has there been any studies or any comparisons between ISIS and the Khmer Rouge?
I don't know. I'm not sure. Yeah, I haven't seen anything, in doing research for this presentation.
Similar nihilistic drive.
Right. Yeah, but no, I haven't seen any.
Sort of modern phenomenon.
I haven't seen any comparisons, in the materials I researched. But there may be. I just haven't come upon anything. So yeah. Thank you. Yes.
I just wanted to discuss the money for a minute.
Sure.
Yeah, one of the things that they've done is go from village to village, town to town, and take over the banks and take money from
Correct.
individuals. And in addition, the people who are foreigners, I received when I was in the Philippines for 6 years and worked with the area of the Abu Sayyaf. And I got a letter saying either you join and become a Muslim, or you pay an enormous amount of money, or we're going to get you. And that's what they do
Oh,
also
yeah.
to get money. So there's multiple ways of bringing in money, and they are very wealthy.
And they're successful in that, of course, because people, it's it's.
And that's a huge difference between Al Qaeda that had money from the really wealthy, whatever.
Right.
But this is like
This is something different,
bringing in
yeah.
every single day, just enormous amounts of money.
Yeah. Well, thank you for. When were you there? Like just.
For 6 years, I've been back a couple of years.
A couple of, so quite recently. Oh, thank you. This is a wonderful example. Case in point.
We're going to have to wrap it up, but I'm really glad you brought that up, and I'm hoping that we can hear a little bit more of your story sometime
yeah.
too. I've heard a little bit of it before, so thank you. That's